Hello, hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
After supper, when the dying flames were chewing through the last of the wood, George rose from the fireside and walked into the cool night air. The dim expanse of his surroundings bloomed as his eyes adjusted to the dark. The Great Plain was a charcoal sketch on blue parchment. The distant grain elevator, a silent titan sleeping on the edge of the earth. The moon dripped golden highlights of flax and honey across his tractor and on the trail of upset earth behind him. His work was going well. A few more days of breaking the ground was all he needed before sowing could begin, and soon his half-section of dead land would be full of life. Of green rows as rigid and orderly as the train track which cut through his field like two solid strips of moonlight. He moved back to the smoldering fire, kicked a couple loose stones at the steel rails, then crawled inside his makeshift shelter, the weathered truck canopy that he had laid on the ground. Once inside, he stripped off his overshirt, slipped into his tattered sleeping bag, and closed his eyes. The nights on the land had been peaceful and quiet, with the occasional call of a coyote, the cry of an owl, or the song of a nightjar. But that night, just as he was drifting off to sleep, George heard and felt a different sound that almost made him bang his head on the canopy ceiling. It began as a low rumble like distant thunder, as if a storm was rolling down the tracks. It grew louder, and George realized it was the sound of a horse galloping down the track line, heading straight toward him. The rumbling hooves pounded the dirt, coming closer and closer until the rocks rattled in the railbed and the ground shook all around him, and he worried that he would either be trampled by the beast or crushed when it struck his half-hidden shelter and came crashing down. George scurried out of the canopy and leapt into the cool air, waving his arms in a panic to warn away this wild horse or rider. But as he looked wild-eyed across the moonlit plain, he saw that it was empty. Nothing was out there, yet the hoofbeats continued right up to where he stood, then roared past him. He whirled around and peered into the night with astonishment as the thundering slowly faded. George stood there for some time, trying to process the experience. The night was clear, the stars were out and the moon was full, the land was washed in their light. He was a farmer, he knew horses, and he was certain that one had just run past him, yet he never saw a thing. George didn't know what to make of this. He thought that maybe his invisible horse was some sort of hallucination caused by all that hard work and poor sleep. But a few days later, when he visited the local store to stock up on supplies, he learned that there may have been a more supernatural explanation. Like in a lot of rural communities, Bickleigh's store was the sole source of everyday necessities, serving as the post office, the gas station, the market, and the outfitter. The mail came every Tuesday and Friday, and that was when the entire district would come out to check the mail, do some shopping, and catch up with their neighbors. When a few of his fellow farmers asked George how his work was going, he hesitated, but ultimately shared the details of his eerie encounter. To his surprise, no one laughed. They listened with quiet interest, and when he was done, they all looked at each other and nodded. Then told George something he didn't expect. It wasn't his imagination. It was the Bickleigh ghost, and others had encountered it too. The first time was in the winter of 1932. You're listening to Fireside Canada, my podcast about Canadian legends, lies, and lore. I'm David Williams. This is part 3 of my 4-part series about ghost town ghosts, featuring tales of terror and dread with a side of history from one of our country's countless vanished communities. Tonight, you'll hear several stories about a mysterious pair of spirits, a horse and its rider, said to haunt a long-vanished stretch of train track that once cut through the northern expanse of the Great Plains. Some say they're little more than a trick of fog in the moonlight. Others say that they're the answer to a century-old mystery. Figment or phantom, it's an excellent piece of folklore from the Canadian West, with ties to a community and a history that's in danger of being forgotten. This is the legend of the Phantom Rider of Bickleigh, Saskatchewan. Part 1. The Phantom Rider. Night had settled on the prairie by the time the Bristow sisters left their neighbor's farmhouse and started for home. It had crept from the shadows of the grain elevator, dug its claws into the crusts of snow, and lay sleeping in the winter air, the yellow moon hanging from its starry jaws, glinting off the frozen fields. Ivy and Annie sat bundled in their sleigh, looking out at the glittering expanse of snow and stars as they glided along the road. The girls chatted gleefully about their day, and their horses were relaxed and happy, trotting with the speed and confidence that comes with a familiar path and a well-lit horizon. But things changed when they arrived at the railroad tracks. The sleigh came to a sudden stop. The horses were nervous, agitated. They snorted and stamped, their eyes bulging with fear as they tried to back away. One of the sisters snapped the reins to compel them forward, but they refused to move. Ivy and Annie stood up and peered over the rail, curious to see what had them so frightened. They could see nothing at first, just the empty rails. But then a ghostly figure appeared from the darkness, as if the moonlight had suddenly taken the form of a man on horseback, glowing, translucent, and silent. The sisters watched in amazement as the apparition galloped past them along the track without making a sound. The rider seemed not to notice the sisters or their sleigh. He kept his dead eyes on the moonlit track ahead. Several yards down, the phantom rider finally faded from view, and the horses suddenly bolted across the tracks, sending the sisters tumbling backward into their seats. The terrified animals couldn't be slowed as they ran the rest of the way to the Bristow farm. As their sleigh skidded down the icy road, the sisters looked over their shoulders to ensure that the hoofbeats behind them were just echoes and not of a spectral horse following them home. The next morning, Ivy and Annie returned to the crossing in the company of their father, where, together, they searched the thin layer of new-fallen snow for any trace of the phantom. They found the impressions left by their own horses glittering in the new-day sun, but little else. It seemed that whatever had crossed their path had never touched the ground. Ever since that night, people would often hear the ghostly sound of an unseen horse galloping along the rails, or catch a glimpse of an otherworldly apparition, sometimes a horse and rider, sometimes just a mysterious light, rushing silently down the track. Exactly where it was going, and why at such a pace, no one could say. They just hoped it wouldn't linger. But according to some, that's exactly what it did. More reports of strange phenomena soon followed that seemed to suggest the Bickleigh rider was not bound to his horse. Every so often, it seemed, he would dismount his ethereal steed and wander through some of the buildings that lined the tracks. The summer after the Bristow sisters' experience, school teacher Joe Pitzel and pool agent Joe Ellis were sharing accommodations on the second floor of the railroad section house. It was a humble arrangement, with 2 single beds on either side of a small table dressed with a starched cloth. A coal oil lamp stood at the back end of the table, serving as the only source of artificial light. At the end of a long day, the young men emptied their pockets onto the table, said goodnight, and blew out the lamp. They were just on the edge of sleep when they heard the sound of coins hitting the floor and rolling to the edges of the room. Moments later, there was the thump and clatter of a pocket knife, and then the dull rattle of a pen. "Do you hear that?" asked one man. "I sure do," replied the other. The 2 men leapt from their beds and struck a match. The room came alive in the flickering orange glow, with long black shadows dancing nervously throughout the room, with the occasional flat side of a coin catching the light. They expected to see an animal of some kind, a cat or a rat, that had somehow snuck inside and knocked things off the table, but nothing was there. They couldn't explain how the lamp had shifted from the back of the table all the way to the front, where it sat teetering on the edge, ready to fall. Nor could they explain how the heavy starched cloth, weighed down by the lamp, had somehow shifted forward as well, letting the contents of the table fall to the floor one by one. Or why it was crumpled in the middle, as if an unseen hand had reached between the men, grabbed it, and pulled. Or maybe they didn't want to imagine what might have been crouched between them in the dark. They reset and lit the lantern, then checked the room. The door was still shut tight, the windows were locked, and nothing else had been disturbed. They cleaned up the mess and went back to bed. They knew logically that the room was empty, but as they lay there in the dark, they couldn't shake the feeling that somehow they weren't alone. A few weeks later, Joe Pitzel would again experience a potentially supernatural event, this time at the home of his friend, Mac McLean. Mac worked as an agent for the United Grain Growers and lived in the grain elevator near the railroad tracks, some distance west of Joe's home. Mac's quarters were attached to the engine room, which in turn was 4 steps below the office. The friends had just sat down for dinner when they heard the office door squeak open and the sound of heavy footsteps move across the floor, down the stairs, and stop outside Mac's door. Mac waved his fork in the air and called out, "Come on in," but whoever was there seemed to linger just behind the door. He called out a second time, but again received no reply. Thinking someone was trying to scare them, Mac crept over to the door and threw it open. No one was there. The men looked at each other, puzzled. Mac ran up the stairs to the office while Joe searched outside. They were completely alone. 2 different men had a similar experience elsewhere in Bickleigh, but still within steps of that same set of tracks. The 2 friends were scavengers who decided to pick through an abandoned house they found slumped by the side of the railway. The windows were thick with grime, the wallpaper was peeling, the clapboard was thin and gray, but they thought that an antique or 2 might still be tucked away in the safety of the cellar. They stopped their car, stepped through the weather-beaten door, and wandered through the dim, dusty rooms until they found the stairwell. At the bottom was a mess of cobwebs, rotten food, and stacked boxes, behind which antique treasures might lie. But just as they started to search for anything of value, they heard the door above them creak open and the sound of someone walking across the floor. It was unmistakable, Each footstep, each creak in the boards above them precipitated a cascade of dust from the cracks in the ceiling. They were shocked. There was no one outside when they arrived, and they had thought that the old house was long abandoned. Maybe they were wrong and were trespassing. They put down the boxes and came upstairs to see who it was and potentially apologize. But when they surfaced, they found that no one was there. They looked in every room. They went outside and circled the building. They even checked the car. There wasn't a soul to be found. There was nowhere to hide either. No other buildings, no trees, just the tracks stretching far and away. The two men who had so boldly explored the abandoned house felt a sudden and overwhelming feeling of fear wash over them. They ran to the car and sped away. Now, all of these events can seem, at first, to be completely separate. Hearing the hoofbeats of an invisible horse is very different from seeing a silent phantom rider gallop across your path. And those experiences, in turn, are very different from having an unseen hand pull objects off a table or hearing ghostly footsteps echo through an empty building. Yet all of these distinct accounts of the supernatural have become united in local tradition, linked together by one shared element: their proximity to the railway. To the people of Bickleigh, the hoofbeats, the manifestations, the manipulated objects, and the footsteps were all the work of just one spirit that haunts a very specific length of track. Even more intriguing, local folklore offers one explanation about who he might be.
Hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little
You
bit.
could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.
Part 2. The Vanished. Located about 200 kilometers southeast of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, on the semi-arid steppes of Palliser's Triangle, what is now the district of Bickleigh began to take shape in 1910, when a handful of people settled in the area, driven by the call of the Canadian government to cultivate and expand the western reaches of the Dominion. In exchange, after 3 years of back-breaking work, they would receive 160 acres of land to call their own. Most homesteaders shipped their belongings by car to the hamlet of Fiskey, Saskatchewan, then loaded up their ox carts with lumber, machinery, and goods, and made the long, slow trek south, about 24 kilometers down the Battleford Trail. Life was hard. Mosquitoes and flies were plentiful, good drinking water was scarce, and the land provided little in the way of food and shelter for the settlers or their livestock. Some left shortly after and returned to their former homes, but many more came in their place, enough to warrant the establishment of a mail service in 1912 and a school and community center in 1914. The name Bickleigh was suggested by one of the area's earliest arrivals, who, as a boy, had grown up near the village of Bickleigh in the county of Devonshire, England. The name was accepted, and a district was born. Telephone lines came through in 1918, and finally, in 1924, the Canadian Pacific Railway decided to build a subdivision that would lead from Milden in the east to McMorran in the west, with Bickleigh as a stop along the way. The intent was to lay a heavy steel track all the way to Drumheller, Alberta, and create a passage through the plains that would make it easier to transport grain to the west and haul coal to the east. Winter had set in by the time the railroad reached Bickleigh, and even at the best of times, winter on the Great Plains is long, dry, and bitterly cold. The ground was frozen 8 feet deep, and the north wind blew so sharp and so cold that the workers' skin would fuse to the jagged iron ties and smooth steel rails. Several horses, employed to haul equipment up and down the line, collapsed from exhaustion and exposure and were buried unmarked in the track bed. The conditions were so terrible that men routinely walked off the job. Those who remained were the most hardened and the most desperate, prone to heavy drinking and ruthless fighting over the slightest insult. According to legend, it was in the midst of that dark season that 2 men came to blows in a vicious and violent altercation. No one knows what started the fight or exactly how it ended, only that when the gray sun dawned the following day, 1 man was missing, never to be heard from again. There was talk of foul play and potential murder. Some on the crew suggested they dig through the track bed to search for his body, but it was cold and they had a schedule to keep. It was much easier to lay down steel than dig through frozen ballast, and really, there was nothing to suggest that he didn't simply abandon his job like so many others did that winter, so they pressed on. In time, the identity of the missing worker was forgotten, but the mystery remained. 8 years later, when the Bristow sisters encountered a phantom rider beneath a pale winter moon, their story began to spread, along with the tale of a forgotten railroad worker who mysteriously disappeared. People wondered, was the Bickleigh ghost the apparition of this missing worker? Was his animal companion the specter of one of the many horses who were worked to death that winter, risen again to run the rails on full moon nights? If so, were they a residual haunting, an echo of the past imprinted on the land that would play out again and again like an old recording? That would certainly be a possibility if George Redhead and the Bristow sisters were the only encounters. But what about Joe Pitzel, Joe Ellis, and Mac McLean? Or the 2 scavengers who were picking through the bones of an abandoned house? The addition of their stories of moving objects and ghostly footsteps places the haunting across several hundred yards of track, both outside on horseback and inside on foot, suggesting that the ghost has agency, perhaps choosing to wander through those places in a desperate attempt to locate his body, or to tell the living that his remains lay somewhere nearby, and that his soul cannot rest. The stories and speculations continued for decades, passed down from generation to generation. The rail line never made it to Drumheller. After the CPR encountered a deep gorge north of Snipe Lake, the railroad abandoned its plans and McMorran became the end of the line. For a while, a mixed-use steam train would routinely roll through Bickleigh, carrying freight, grain, and passengers, and one wonders if the engineers ever saw something strange on the tracks as they chugged their way across that lonely expanse. The land beneath Bickleigh is notoriously hard to farm, and as time wore on, after countless acres were destroyed again and again by drought, hail, wind, and frost, many families chose to leave their homesteads for more fertile grounds. The passenger service was terminated in 1958. In the winter of 1980, the entire line was abandoned. In 81, the rails and ties were taken up. They stored whatever steel they could and sold the remainder to a razor blade company. For the first time in over 50 years, the track bed was exposed, and some wondered if they should start digging for the bodies that were said to have been buried there over half a century earlier. But before anyone could begin looking for bones, some were found by accident. In 1982, Bruce MacDonald was cultivating a field less than a kilometer south of the abandoned railway when he spotted a round white rock shining in the sun. He stopped his tractor and stepped down to investigate. As he drew closer, he realized that it wasn't a rock, but a human skull. He knelt down and brushed away the soil. His stomach dropped as each swipe of his hand revealed a new terror, a rib, an arm bone, a leg bone. Bruce handed the partial skeleton over to the RCMP, who took the remains to Dr. Ernest Walker, an expert in forensic identification at the University of Saskatchewan. There wasn't much to go on, but the anthropologist was able to come to a few conclusions. They belonged to a husky man of average height, who was about 25 years old at the time of his death, and his bones had laid undisturbed in that field for roughly 60 years, around the same time that the railway was coming through. Were these the remains of that legendary worker who had vanished without a trace one cold winter's night? No one could say for sure. All they could do was bury what was left of the body and hope that the infamous Bickleigh ghost would finally be at peace. The Phantom Rider did make one more recorded appearance, though this one was far more easily explained. On a hot, exceptionally windy Saturday in July 1988, the people of Bickleigh held the district's 75th annual picnic, better known to the locals as Sports Day. Amidst the popular horse show, fastball tournament, and musical acts, an anonymous rider, clad in a white costume and skull mask and mounted on a lively pinto, made a brief tour of the grounds, to the cheers of many in the crowd. The Bickleigh ghost had become a true part of community folklore. The history of Bickleigh is not unlike countless other communities that once dotted the prairies. These places trace the history of Canadian expansionism, that time in the mid-19th century when the government pushed to colonize the West and keep the Americans below the international boundary. The Transcontinental Railway, a key component for Confederation, was carved through that vast expanse in a fervent effort to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific and unite the country, all while supplying the coastal cities with a fresh supply of homegrown grain, and the prairies with a steady stream of foreign farmers dreaming of a better life. But poor soil, inhospitable weather, and unexpected geographic challenges continually challenged their existence. The prairies were hit hard by the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, and as automobiles grew in popularity and railways were replaced by highways, communities like Bickleigh began to disappear. In 1983, the year after Bruce McDonald's grisly discovery, the original United Grain Growers elevator, which had sat abandoned in Bickleigh for 5 years, was demolished. A small crowd gathered to watch, and many were struck by how this giant building, an iconic regional landmark that had stood for decades, could be toppled so easily by one small bulldozer. In a single moment, the iconic structure came crashing down near the empty trackbed, and it was burned where it fell. The destruction of the elevator and abandonment of the spur were manifestations of social shifts that had been taking place for years. Between 1981 and 1991, the greater municipality shrank by 24%, and the hamlet of Bickleigh became, like the rail line and its ghosts, more of a memory than anything else. Today, there are a few scattered farmhouses, an abandoned barn or two still standing, and an unmarked dirt road, 1 mile in length, that still carries the name Railway Avenue. There is also the railbed, cutting like a scar across the prairie, and reminding us that the land has memory too. Though the steam train, the steel tracks, and most of the people are gone, the signs, the stories, and the specters of the past still remain. And maybe the Phantom Rider is still out there too, wandering the foundations of long, toppled houses and galloping through the lonely fields with only the moon to bear witness. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and for joining me in becoming part of a Canadian folk tradition. Now that you know the story, share it. And remember, if you're ever out in the prairie on a full moon night and hear or see a horse and rider coming toward you, it might just be the Bickleigh ghost, riding hard on his way to eternity. Fireside Canada is written and recorded by me, David Williams, with sound design by Matt Kesselman. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Diana Key is our business manager. Jordan Heath Rawlings is our executive producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving this podcast a positive review. If you want to help even further, you can provide story ideas and more through my website. Every little bit helps to keep the fire burning and the library of legends growing. Learn more at firesidecanada.ca.
Hello, I'm Malik.
I'm Jamie.
And this is World Gone Wrong, where we discuss the unprecedented times we're living through.
Can your manager still schedule you for night shifts after that werewolf bit you?
My ex-boyfriend was replaced by an alien body snatcher, but I think I like him better now.
Who is this dude showing up in everyone's old pictures?
My friend says the sewer alligators are reading maps now.
When did the kudzu start making that humming sound?
We are just your normal millennial roommates processing our feelings about a chaotic world in front of some microphones.
World Gone Wrong, a new fiction podcast from Audacious Machine Creative, creators of Unwell, a Midwestern Gothic mystery. Learn more at audaciousmachinecreative.com.
Find World Gone Wrong in all the regular places you find podcasts.
I love you so much. I mean, you could, up the energy a little bit.
You could up the energy.
I actually don't take notes.
That was good.
I'm just kidding. You sounded great.
So did you.